Well, hello again, and welcome to Hidden History Stories from the Secret City. I'm Ray Smith, and I'm sorry that Keith McDaniel, my partner, can't be here this morning. He's got some health issues in his family that he's dealing with. But I have a special guest with me today. Uh, Tom Ramos is here, and Tom is a physicist. He's spent a career, among other things he's done. He spent a good bit of years at Lawrence Livermore Laboratory, and he has written a book that we want to talk about. But Tom, go ahead and tell us a little more about yourself, and then we'll get into the book from Berkeley to Berlin.
Good morning, Ray. Thank you. Yes, you're right. I am a physicist at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, but I started in the Army, actually. If you want, I'm a graduate of West Point. I was commissioned around the time of Vietnam. The Army was tossing me around between Vietnam and stuff, but I first started out in Europe, worked as a NATO officer actually there, and saw a lot of the defense. I helped prepare some of the defensive plans we had against the Red Army invading Germany and that. And anyway, my orders to Vietnam kind of got switched. I ended up in Korea, commanding a company in Korea with that idiot Kim Il Sung up there making trouble. And then in the goodness of their heart, the Army sent me a letter to told me I had to go to find a graduate school to study nuclear science. So from a rice paddy in Korea, I wrote a letter and was accepted at MIT. So I came back to the United States, and the Army gave me 2 years to get a master's degree, which is what I did. I got a master's degree in physics at MIT, worked with a wonderful group there. In fact, Sam Ting was a member of the group. He won the Nobel Prize while I was there. So it was pretty hot and heavy. And then I went back to West Point to teach physics for 4 years to some great cadets. And after that, I decided I wanted to be a professional physicist. And that's when I applied for a job and was accepted to go to Lawrence Livermore National Lab, where I joined a program that was a wonderful man. It was my mentor, frankly. His name was George Mention. He has a whole story behind himself, but he was telling me he wanted to make a laser that was pumped by a hydrogen bomb, and I thought that was nuts. And I ended up joining the group, and that became what was known as the X-ray laser program. And so I was a member of that, and I actually stayed with that program throughout the rest of the Cold War, and ended up leading a group of physicists, and we designed the most brilliant laser in the history of the program, probably the history of mankind, I guess. Yeah. And from there, I went on to Washington. I helped with the START 2 talks. Brent Scowcroft was the National Science Advisor, President Bush, and I joined that committee with him. I worked for a great man named Vic Alessi and was prepared the Secretary of Energy for what the Department of Energy positions are going to be for START. So I got my taste in it. And then from that, I moved on and became the Legislative Affairs Officer for the Nuclear Weapons Council of the United States. And they help prepare nuclear policy for the nation. And so everything those people said to Congress, I wrote for a couple of years. And then I had enough of Washington, got back to Livermore. I started a program because I knew nuclear testing was stopping. Without nuclear testing, you're not going to design a nuclear weapon. And the group, I led an analysis group. And anyway, we started a program on counterproliferation, which was extremely successful. The Secretary of Defense, William Cohen, called it the most successful program in the defense establishment. So I had a really rich, like I said, varied history. And then about 10 years ago, Bruce Goodwin, who was the Associate Director for Nuclear Weapons, asked me to write a history of one part of our history of the Robin, which is a atom bomb that had been designed by the lab back in the 1950s. In the course of doing that, I started writing a lot more. He loved what I was doing. And I launched a new career, basically, of history at the laboratory, and learned one hell of a lot. I'm sorry for the language, but learned a lot about how Livermore got created in the first place. Right. And it became a history of how a strategic deterrent plan was created for the Cold War. And it was extraordinarily interesting. It brought things like Rand Corporation and other kind of entities. And in my book, which I wrote at the behest of Harold Brown, our former Secretary of Defense under Jimmy Carter, Brown said, "Tom, you need to make this an unclassified history," and that became the book.
Oh.
And the climax of that, of course, is when President Kennedy came back to Berkeley to talk to the Livermore physicists and to thank them for averting a nuclear war. And in my introduction, I said, "What did they do to get Kennedy's thanks?" And I said, "This book will tell their story." So there you go. How's that for a long story?
Oh, no, no, thank you. What a tremendous and varied career you've had, and you've been involved in some of the key points of history there, and have documented it. Let's just go right into talking about the book From Berkeley to Berlin. Let you go ahead and make your presentation on that. I
All right.
think our viewers are interested enough now that they'd be intrigued by what you've done.
I'll put my mouth in fifth gear. I will go as fast as I can. So I don't want to take up too much time
It'll
with
be all
you.
right.
I'd much rather be answering questions.
I understand. All right,
Let's see.
that looks good.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So, well, that's what the book looks like. And if you will, if you want to know the story of Los Alamos, story of Livermore, our two nuclear weapons laboratories, you have to know the history of Berkeley because they both started in Berkeley, and they both started when Sproul, who was the president of the University of California, recruited a hot item of the time, a physicist who at the time was at Yale University. His name was Ernest Orlando Lawrence. And they recruited Lawrence and they brought him to Berkeley. And Sproul was very quickly rewarded when Lawrence invented the cyclotron. Mm-hmm. And with it, he was given a building by Sproul, and that building, Lawrence created a laboratory, which became the University of California Radiation Laboratory. And this is the place where they housed these cyclotrons. It was called the Rad Lab by everyone. And the Rad Lab attracted some of the biggest, brightest experimental physicists in the nation. They all started flocking into Berkeley to work with Lawrence and his machines. And things were going swimmingly. As I mentioned here in my thing, five physicists who joined the lab would win Nobel Prizes. I mean, they were doing dramatic science. But in the December 1938, I'm going to really go quickly here and skip a lot of the history. But in an experiment in Berlin by Otto Hahn, a chemist, he made a really interesting discovery when he tried to replicate an experiment by an Italian physicist by the name of Enrico Fermi, one of the greatest physicists of the 20th century. And when he did, he saw what Fermi had seen, which by shooting neutrons into a foil of uranium, he got just a great amount of radiation coming out of the foil, and he had no idea what it meant. And Hahn's partner through the years was a woman from Vienna. Her name was Lisa Meitner. She was Jewish, and so she had to leave Germany because of when Hitler became chancellor. And so she was in Sweden. Anyway, he writes a letter to it, and remarkably, within 4 or 5 days, Lisa Meitner comes back with a theory of nuclear fission. And what she claimed was that the neutrons had actually split apart the uranium nuclei. Mm-hmm. And she wrote this up with her nephew in a journal, Nature, in Great Britain. But then it immediately raised questions, because in their article they said, by the way, these reactions are 1,000,000 times more energetic than typical chemical reactions like that would be involved with dynamite or TNT. Huh. And the implications that now you had a new form of energy 1,000,000 times more powerful than what we were used to seeing raised the specter of with Hitler. This was discovered in Hitler's Berlin. That Hitler having access to that kind of energy was not good news. And but anyway, the paper raised the question: if there was so much energy being released, why didn't the foil melt or disintegrate? Because there was a huge amount of energy. There was a lot of neutrons hitting the foil, but yet the foil was still a foil at the end of it. And the answer to that came from a Dane and an American. The American was John Wheeler, and the Dane was Niels Bohr. And they met at Princeton, and they wrote a paper, and they said, well, the reason is not every uranium atom split. It was only uranium-235 that split, which was a very small fraction of the atoms inside the foil. And that answered the question. But that raised the implication, and immediately nuclear physicists, including Lawrence, realized if you wanted to make an atomic bomb, you would have to separate out the uranium-235 from the uranium-238, which was the predominant isotope in uranium. And Lawrence invented a machine to do just that, called it the Calutron. And he went to Washington, and he gave his ideas to a guy we would now call the president's science advisor. His name was Vannevar Bush. And Bush was not certain you could do this. He didn't think you could make an atomic bomb, and things kind of sat down and nobody did anything until the British also picked up on this idea, and they wrote a report and they shared it with the Americans. It's called the Maud Report. Mm-hmm. And at first, Bush even ignored that. And then the author of the Maud Report, one of the principal authors, his name was Mark Oliphant. He flew out to Berkeley, met with Lawrence, and pleaded with Lawrence that America needed to get involved, because if they didn't, there was a threat that Hitler could develop an atomic bomb by himself. Mm-hmm. And Lawrence understood that and got Oliphant an audience with Bush. And to make a long story short, Bush was finally convinced, and he went to see President Roosevelt, and they started up an atomic program. Then with starting up the atomic program, the first need was to get the uranium-235. And that's when Bush went back to Lawrence's idea of the Calutron. And they had scouted out a site in Tennessee. Locals called it Oak Ridge. And in it, Bush decided he'd put a big factory to create the uranium-235 using Lawrence's idea. And you see in the picture in the very bottom, those are the Calutrons at Oak Ridge that were making the uranium-235 during the war. Let's see. In addition, Bush realized he needed a big organization to build the atomic bomb. The RAD lab was just a research lab. He couldn't do that. And so he went to the United States Army, and General Marshall agreed to take on that mission. He later would appoint Colonel Dick Groves, to take over that mission. And then Groves realized he needed a laboratory now to design that weapon, make the final designs. And he flew out to Berkeley, and he asked Lawrence to create that laboratory. And Lawrence said he had his hands full trying to get the Calutrons running at the Y-12 plant at Oak Ridge. And he introduced him to his theoretical physicist, who is a member of the RAD lab. His name is Bob Oppenheimer. And then Groves met with Oppenheimer. He agreed with Lawrence, and Oppenheimer then took on the mission of creating a laboratory to design an atomic bomb. And of course, that would become Los Alamos. And then during the war, Los Alamos, I'm going to go back for a second. During the war, Los Alamos came up, and the original design was to to create a critical mass of uranium-235. And that was straightforward. You had two subcritical masses, and you put a propellant behind one of them, and you smashed one into the other. And then when they smashed together, they became a supercritical mass, and then they exploded in a large explosion. What I failed to tell you is that while all this was happening, back at the RAD lab in Berkeley, another one of Lawrence's physicists, his name was Edwin McMillan, he ended up working with another chemist, Glenn Seaborg, and the two of them discovered another element which we now call plutonium. And it was quickly discovered plutonium also would conduct nuclear fission, just like uranium-235. And so there was a plan to try to make plutonium an atomic bomb. The problem they had, though, is that plutonium was 1,000 times more radioactive than uranium-235. And so if you tried to smash two subcritical masses of plutonium together, the neutrons from one would hit the other too quickly, and it would, if you will, pre-detonate. It would get too hot too quickly, and by the time they crash together, what you would get is a flash of neutrons coming out, but you would not get a huge explosion because it was already so hot, it was already blowing itself apart. But then a member at Los Alamos, actually the head of the physics department at Caltech, he came up with an idea. Instead of smashing the two blobs together, which took 2 milliseconds, 0.002 of a second. He came up with an idea of imploding, that is, surrounding a subcritical mass of plutonium with high explosives. When you set off the high explosive, they would squish the plutonium together into a critical mass. The advantage of that is that would have happened 1,000 times faster than trying to move the two masses together. And that was so fast that the extra radioactivity of plutonium didn't matter anymore, and you would still get that. Explosion. So,
and who was that did that?
yeah, I'm trying.
Oh, okay,
I'm having a brain cramp, and I'm trying to remember his name.
That's all right.
Okay, I'm sorry, but he was the head of the physics department. He had one of his students working with him, a guy named Sid Niedermeyer.
Yeah.
And Niedermeyer did go through and made a lot of the details on how you would make this implosion bomb. But the original idea was, and some of the audience probably knows his name. He was in the movie Oppenheimer. He was in that movie Oppenheimer. I'm sorry, I'm having a brain cramp. I can't remember his name.
That's okay, no problem. Now let's go back, just if you don't mind, just a moment to the discovery of plutonium, and how did they make that discovery, Glenn Seaborg, and how did they determine that it was fissionable?
Okay, it starts with Edwin McMillan, one of Lawrence's physicists at the Rad Lab. He was also a chemist, but he was mostly a physicist. He wanted to replicate the experiment that Otto Hahn had done in Berlin. He wanted to see, can he make nuclear fission? Right. And so he got a foil of uranium, but his source of neutrons is going to be from the cyclotrons, which would be a lot more neutrons than you ever got from radium, which is the way Otto Hahn had done it in Berlin. And so he did the experiment, and sure enough, immediately he saw the nuclear fission, just like Otto Hahn had seen. But McMillan, being McMillan, he dug further into it, and he looked at the foil of uranium that had not, and he looked at the uranium atoms that had not split, and these were the uranium-238. And McMillan guessed, and he could guess correctly, that the uranium-238, instead of splitting, it simply absorbed the neutron and became uranium-239, if you will. And so now he had a sample, and then he, as a chemist, he separated out the uranium-239, and he saw that this decayed much more rapidly than normal uranium. Uranium is like 500 million year half-life. It's very, very stable. Right. But this uranium-239 was decaying with a half-life of like 4.5 days. And he correctly surmised uranium-239 was what we call beta decay. One of the neutrons was turning into a proton and emitting an electron, which is called a beta particle. Anyway, so uranium-239, which had 92 protons, changed into element 93. It had 93 protons. And McMillan called this the element, this new element he had discovered. He named it after the next planet, after Uranus. Uranium is named after Uranus. The next planet out is Neptune, and he called this new element Neptunium. And then he got called off, and he got called off to help Lawrence creating another laboratory at MIT, the MIT Radiation Lab. And so McMillan took off for Cambridge, Massachusetts, and that's where Glenn Seaborg sent him a telegram and said, "Hey, Ed, do you mind if I take over your experiment until you get back?" And McMillan said, "Fine." And Seaborg was a phenomenally good chemist, and he separated out the neptunium. He had a pure sample of neptunium, and he noticed it decayed. It also decayed very rapidly. And it also decayed by beta decay. And so element 93, neptunium, was decaying into element 94. And the next planet after Neptune is Pluto. Yeah. And so Seaborg called it plutonium, became the new element, plutonium. And then Seaborg then took a minute sample of plutonium, and he shot neutrons at it, and he saw that the plutonium fission just as more readily than uranium-235. And so and the plutonium, this new element they discovered, had a half-life of 24,000 years. So it was very stable. And so you had now a alternative fuel besides uranium-235 to fuel an atomic bomb. You had either uranium-235 or you had plutonium. The thing I wanted to bring up is both of these things were discovered at Berkeley. Yeah, it's not well known. I mean, the calutron that would separate out the uranium-235 and the discovery of plutonium all occurred at the Rad Lab in Berkeley. Okay,
Right. And
and when they
yeah, you made a really good explanation of that transition from uranium 238 to plutonium 239, and I appreciate that. Thank you for that.
You're most welcome. Okay, so now we'll go back. Now we'll go on.
Hmm?
Then the war ends. They made the two bombs, one out of plutonium, one out of uranium. Of course, that ended the World War II. And during that time, when Oppenheimer had started and took on the challenge of creating this new laboratory, he went around trying to recruit the best physicists in the nation to come. And one of the first physicist on his list was Enrico Fermi, and who had come in from Italy because of the fascist regime of in Italy, that he needed to get away because his wife was Jewish, and so he used the money from his Nobel Prize to obtain a position at Columbia University, and so he became a member of the faculty of Columbia. Anyway, Fermi was here in America. Oppenheimer recruited him, and Fermi said, "I'll come, but I'd like it if you invited my friend Edward Teller to come with me." Fermi and Teller had met each other in 1933. They became fast friends, and they worked really well. Teller was a Hungarian-born physicist, born in Budapest, and he was one of those brilliant young physicists too. He went to Germany for his PhD. His PhD advisor was Werner Heisenberg, and so he studied at the University of Leipzig. And Teller's roommate, actually, in graduate school was Rudolf Peil, who was the author of that Maud report I told you about. When the British wrote the report that had to convince Vannevar Bush, that was written mostly by Rudolf Peil, who was also Edward's roommate. So these people were really close together. They all knew each other. Right. And so anyway, Oppenheimer said to Fermi, "Sure, well, I'll bring in Teller too." And right before they came to Los Alamos, Teller and Oppenheimer were off on a walk, and then Fermi asked Teller, "Do you think it's possible we could use the energy from an atomic blast to start fusion reactions, and we'll make a bigger bomb from that?" And Teller was not sure, but he went back, did some calculations with some other physicists, and came back and told Fermi, "It just might be possible. It just might be possible." And Teller went ahead and became almost an obsession with him to answer Fermi's question. And he created a design which he called the super. And the super bomb basically would use an atomic bomb to generate energy. And that energy would be used to fuse together more atoms. Now, fusion is the kind of the opposite of fission. Fission, you split apart the nucleus of a heavy atom. In fusion, you usually have very light atoms like hydrogen, and you smash them together at a really high speed. And when they smash together and they fuse together to form a single nucleus, they release a great amount of energy too. And in fact, that's the way the sun makes energy. That was discovered in the early 1930s. Exactly the way the sun was making energy was through fusion. And now with physicists, we had Boltzmann. Ludwig Boltzmann was a Viennese physicist in the 1800s. He came up with a great relationship that would relate kinetic energy, like balls moving really quickly, and could relate that as a temperature. And to a physicist, you could relate energy as either a temperature or as kinetic energy, either way. And so it became customary for the physicists to deal with this new fusion stuff. Instead of saying to raise these atoms to high kinetic energies, physicists would simply say, you're going to raise them to high temperatures. And for that reason, this branch, this causing fusions to create fusion reactions, was called thermonuclear reactions, high temperature reactions, if you will. And so the super was basically a thermonuclear weapon. This would be to use high temperatures to fuse together. And so that's the source of these terms. And anyway, during the Manhattan Project at Los Alamos, Teller tried, he created a group. They tried to put together the super, but they had a lot of problems and they did not make much progress. And at the end, towards the end of the Manhattan Project, Oppenheimer told Teller he was shutting down the whole super project. There was no longer a need, no longer an interest, and we're not going to do it. And Teller got despondent over all of this, and he quit Los Alamos and he joined Fermi up at Chicago after the war, immediately after the war. Mm-hmm. And so that's what he was doing. So then, but then after that, Oppenheimer leaves. He leaves Los Alamos and he goes back to the rad lab at Berkeley. So he rejoins Lawrence, works with Lawrence at Berkeley, and then he's offered a job to run the Institute of Advanced Studies at Princeton, and he'll later accept that and he'll move off to Princeton. In the meantime, a guy named Norris Bradbury will replace Oppenheimer at Los Alamos, and he entices Teller to come back to Los Alamos, and he gives him a contract, and Teller agrees. He comes back to Los Alamos, and he starts up a program to try to still make that super. Okay, then in 1949, the Russians detonate an atomic bomb. Right. And Lawrence gets attracted again. And just like 10 years earlier, when he got nervous over the Germans having an atomic bomb by themselves, he knew very well the Russians knew everything we were doing. In fact, Klaus Fuchs, famous spy, had been arrested by this time by the English. And he knew the Russians knew everything we were doing. And there was no doubt the Russians would also pursue a super. And so Lawrence got involved and tried once again to start convincing the government, we have a threat steamrolling towards us. This time, it's not Hitler with an atomic bomb. It would be Stalin with a hydrogen bomb coming at us. And we need to do something to make sure we're not caught alone. And to do that, he went down to Los Alamos. He met with Teller and his group, and they found that they needed a lot of tritium. And so tritium is an isotope of hydrogen. So to make the tritium, Lawrence came up with a plan to create an accelerator that could create it. It was a huge thing. It was much too big for Berkeley. And so he asked the Pentagon, is there any property he could use to create this thing? And they said, well, take over any World War II installation that's been abandoned. And so Lawrence went around the Bay Area. He looked at Camp Parks. He looked at a bunch of places, but then he went with Louis Alvarez, one of his lieutenants. And when they got to the Livermore Naval Air Station, it had an indoor swimming pool, an Olympic-sized swimming pool that was indoors. And according to Alvarez, Lawrence walked in there, looked at the swimming pool, turned around and said, "Louis, we found a home." And so it was the swimming pool that got him to Livermore. And so Lawrence creates this accelerator. It's called the Mass Test Accelerator, and they start building it there at Livermore, and you could see where it was being built. By the time they got it all built, the shortages of tritium and uranium and plutonium had all been kind of solved, and so by the time they built it, it was no really needed anymore. Huh. And they were going to shut everything. They were about to shut that down, but then Oppenheimer had a big influence at Los Alamos. He was highly respected there. And when he left Los Alamos, he actually gave a lecture and suggested that working on nuclear weapons was immoral. And that had a profound effect. And so the passion at Los Alamos to create the super was not really high. And it was being noticed within the Pentagon. The Deputy Secretary of Defense even said, this is not good. The Air Force got so excised over it that they decided they're going to create their own laboratory in Illinois, in Chicago, right outside of Chicago, and maybe get Fermi to run it. That didn't work out too well. But then the Congress had created the Atomic Energy Commission. They went to see a commissioner went to see, his name was Murray, went to see Lawrence and asked Lawrence to create another laboratory, this time to create a thermonuclear weapon. Lawrence agreed that there was not enough energy going on at Los Alamos, and he agreed, okay, he'll start yet another laboratory. Now, he already had the operations going on at Livermore, and so they just created they started this new laboratory on the 2nd day of September 1952. You can see a sign up there on the top. You see it says University of California Radiation Lab. This is Lawrence's RAD lab, but it's now the Livermore site. So it became an adjunct to the RAD lab, if you will. What we call, associate director. And he asked one of his physicists that had been running things down at the Y-12 plant at Oak Ridge during the war, and had become a professor of physics at Berkeley. His name was Herb York. And he said, Herb, I'd like you to take over operations out at Livermore. Let's get this thing started. York agreed. And so on the second day of September, the the Rad Lab extended itself to Livermore, to the Livermore site, which is why there was now a nuclear weapons nuclear weapons laboratory at Livermore. And one of the first things Lawrence asked Herb York to do is try to recruit Teller, who by this time had quit Los Alamos a second time over his frustrations to try to get a super done. And he'd gone back to Chicago again. And Lawrence told York, recruit Teller, let's get Teller into Livermore because we'll pick up where he left off at Los Alamos. Oh. And so they do that. And so in the bottom picture, you see the three main characters at Livermore. There's Lawrence on the left, the guy who really created it, Edward in the middle, and then Herb York on the right, who is basically an associate director running operations in Livermore. Mm-hmm. Okay, now they needed to get things going. And so York asked Teller to take over. What are we going to do for the next test? Teller was the only guy that had experience. And Teller had in his mind to mix the hydrogen in with the atom bomb so that you would get this fusion, this thermonuclear weapon could all be accomplished in one fell swoop, boom, one shot. What I have failed to tell you is when he was back at Los Alamos, right before he left, they were trying to design the super, and it just appeared it would not work calculationally. On his team was a Polish mathematician by the name of Stanislaw Ulam. Ulam had been brought in by a Hungarian mathematician by the name of von Neumann. Anyway, Ulam had come up with a brand new way of doing calculations, which we now call the Monte Carlo way. And in that, it showed that Teller's ideas for super were not going to work. And so Ulam came in and he met with Teller, and the two of them got together and they came up with a new idea. And what it was is basically, let's just take the energy from the atom bomb, like you said, and you make a channel, and you channel that energy down to a second device called a secondary, which would be composed of thermonuclear fuel. And then you would compress that thermonuclear fuel and it would explode as a hydrogen bomb. And that they thought, and that looked like it was going to work. Okay. And that would be tested in November of 52, 2 months after the Livermore Laboratory was created. That was the Mike device, and it worked. It worked like a charm. It was 1,000 times more powerful than an atomic bomb. The mystery thing, and it took me months to figure this, why this happened, was Teller, for some reason, after he invents this new hydrogen bomb, he goes back to his original ideas on a super, and his original ideas were going to be to mix in the material, instead of having a primary and a secondary, mix everything into one. And it was not a good idea. And so, I'm sorry, I'll go back here a second. And so the first test was, which was one of these, they're called a hydride test, which was, it failed miserably. And it didn't look good, very good for the laboratory. And then the next year, they were going to test the hydrogen bomb out in the Pacific. Teller again went back to his original ideas. It didn't work, and things were really looking bad. So let me now go. I'm sorry, I'm jumping around a little bit. Let me talk about some of the legacies here. Mm-hmm. One of the biggest legacies at Livermore was Lawrence's management and his leadership style. Lawrence was a phenomenal leader. He just attracted talented people to him, but he also had an interesting way of managing his stuff, and it's called matrix management. In it, you create your classic divisions. You'll have your physics, you'll have theoretical and experimental physics divisions, you'll have a chemistry division, you'll have mechanical engineering, electrical engineering divisions, and your experts would come out of that and they would build things. But in Lawrence's management system, you identify a problem. You say, I got a goal here. I got a problem I want to fix. And you take a very talented member of your staff and you say, you're the new program leader, and I want you to solve this problem. And so you create a program, and then the program leader goes and he selects people from the various divisions, and he create a program. It's a highly eclectic. It has chemists in it, engineers, physicists, but they're all working together for the program leader. And this highly eclectic thing makes things very innovative because you have ideas coming from different angles, and they share these, and they all feel empowered to do that. And it was a very innovative environment. And that was created at Livermore, and it had a huge impact. It would have a huge impact on the laboratory and on the nation, as it turned.
Absolutely. That is the origin of project management.
It was incredibly successful. It takes a lot of work to make that thing work, but yeah. Lawrence truly forced that onto Herb York and the other managers. You will do it this way, and that's the way they did it, and it worked. Oh. One thing I failed to mention earlier was Lawrence had also created a laboratory during World War II at MIT, excuse me, which was used to develop radar. And yeah. one of the people that worked for him out there was a great physicist by the name of David Griggs. After the war, Griggs became, the Air Force created the RAND project. And I won't go through the history of that, but Griggs became the physics leader. He was the first man hired into RAND. And Griggs was a personal friend of Lawrence and of Louis Alvarez. And when Griggs takes over, he tells his people, go up to Livermore and find out what they're doing. Important things are going on, and I want you to find out what's happening. Now, RAND basically was coming up, they were policy analysts coming up with strategic deterrent plans for the Air Force and the nation, because the Air Force at the time was the only service with atomic weapons. Mm-hmm. And so these RAND analysts came up to Livermore. Among them, I showed you the picture too, Herman Kahn, Bill Kaufman. If you don't know these people, Herman Kahn later was characterized by Hollywood as Dr. Strangelove in the movie Dr. Strangelove. It's a caricature of Herman Kahn. He was a phenomenal intellect. Bill Kaufman would later become the head of the political science department at MIT for 25 years. And it was Kaufman who put together a strategic plan that was adopted by President Kennedy's administration. And that became the basic strategic plan that carried us through the Cold War. These individuals were all coming up to Livermore. I have some more names, Bernard Brody, Albert Wohlstetter, Dick and Al Latter. So these phenomenal intellects were all coming up. And with Lawrence's matrix management system, they were just two more matrix personnel, and they would just join into programs. You know, you had an electrician, you had a mechanical engineer, and you had a policy analyst. It didn't matter. You know, these was a highly eclectic environment already. And they worked extraordinarily well with the physicist. And they started saying, well, look, if these weapons are going to make any kind of sense, they have to have these attributes. They need to be small, for example. Mm-hmm. They need to be highly survivable. And so what was very unique is that in this stage of the Cold War, you had policy analysts working very closely with physicists in designing the nuclear stockpile that would deter the Russians.
Wow.
Okay, another legacy that came to the lab is was a man named John von Neumann, probably the greatest mathematician of the 20th century. He came immediately to the lab, took up residence here, and he convinced the laboratory management and he convinced the scientists at Livermore and elsewhere that if you're going to build a thermonuclear weapon, you have to first model it. And von Neumann was instrumental in inventing the very first digital computers. Now you're going to tell me, oh, no, Tom, Alan Turing did that. Well, yes, Turing was very important, but Turing, who was Turing's advisor? That was John von Neumann. Von Neumann grabbed Turing out of England, brought him to Princeton. And it's at Princeton where Turing got his PhD, working with von Neumann. And they remained close friends when Turing went back to England. And von Neumann put together pretty much the first truly digital computer. It was called a Maniac. It was named after the Army's ENIAC, and then von Neumann came up with a Maniac. And that was shipped off. He built it, and then a copy of it was sent off to Los Alamos that they were using to design the very first thermonuclear device, the Mike device. And while he was at Livermore, von Neumann just inculcated a computer culture among the physicists at the lab. I talked with Mike May, John Knuckles, other people who were around at the time. And I asked them, what was it like when you got hired at the lab? And they said, well, I was there. And within a couple of days, Professor von Neumann would come tap me on the shoulder and said, Mike, I need a computer code for a thermonuclear device, for a radiation channel, or to do radiation transport. And so, these guys would go in and the first thing they did at the lab was start with making computer models. And pretty soon a computer culture was built at Livermore, where you first had to make computer modeling of anything you were doing to understand the physics. And then only did you go and do the experimentation. And that had another profound effect on Livermore, why Livermore was able to leapfrog ahead later on because of the use of this brand new computer science. Another individual came over, John Wheeler. I mentioned him earlier. He worked with Niels Bohr to prove that uranium-235 was the fission element in uranium. Wheeler took up residence at Livermore also, and he would get physicists together and he'd have seminars and he would go over problems with thermonuclear weapons on how to solve these problems. And it was like he was like a Pied Piper of sorts. And these young 20-year-old physicists would all gather around Wheeler and they would all work together. And so you had phenomenal intellects at Livermore all working together to develop these thermonuclear weapons, and it would have profound effects. Okay. I mentioned that Teller wanted to do a hydride. He did his first 2 tests for hydrides. They were called the Ruth and Ray events, and they were fizzle, what we call a fizzle. They really didn't work. I think they were supposed to get a kiloton. They got 80 tons as a yield.
Yeah.
Teller was not dissuaded. The next year out at the Pacific, they were supposed to make a megaton weapon, and it did not work at all. It gave no yield at all. And so Norris Bradbury, the director of Los Alamos, and then people at the Atomic Energy Commission, led by Robbie, asked to shut down Livermore, that it was a failure. It was, the whole idea was a whole failure. And they were coming awfully close to shutting Livermore down. And right at that time, right after the failure, it was called the Kuhn event in the Pacific, William Borden had written a letter to J. Edgar Hoover, testifying that in the letter it said that Oppenheimer's wife, his mistress, his brother, all card-carrying communists, that Oppenheimer himself was very active in communist organizations, and suggested strongly that Oppenheimer was suspect. And Hoover sent the letter up to President Eisenhower. Eisenhower had just written an executive order saying anyone with a security clearance that showed any signs of irregularity would immediately have their clearances investigated. And so this clearly met the case. And so Eisenhower ordered the head of the Atomic Energy Commission, Lewis Strauss, to revoke Oppenheimer's Q clearance, his clearance to see atomic secrets. And so Strauss did. And then Strauss called Oppenheimer into his office and told him everything that happened. And he said, you can, by next June, your tour with us is over by next June. We can just quietly let you go out to pasture, or you can object, or you can fight this. And anyway, Oppenheimer decided to contest this, and he wanted a hearing. He demanded to have a hearing so he would to get his clearance back. At the hearing, he immediately anyway, they're going to have this hearing. I'm sorry. And at the beginning of the hearing, he immediately admitted that he had lied to security personnel, Army personnel, about attempts of the Communist Party to get atomic secrets from him. And when they asked, why did you lie to the security personnel? Oppenheimer said, because I was an idiot. So even at that point, I think most of us would understand you would have your clearance revoked. I mean, you don't lie to security personnel.
Right.
But Oppenheimer even admitted it. But that was not enough for Strauss. Strauss had a personal thing against Oppenheimer, and he wanted to prove he was a Soviet agent, a Soviet spy for some reason. And to do that, he wanted to use Oppenheimer's efforts to shut down the thermonuclear program in America as evidence that he was a Soviet spy. That was tenuous at best. And where are you going to get witnesses to talk about the thermonuclear program, but from Berkeley and Livermore? And so the biggest witnesses being called in were Lawrence, Teller, Louis Alvarez, David Griggs, those names I've already brought up in this lecture. They're all called in to testify about how Oppenheimer had sabotaged the thermonuclear program of America. Now, none of them had thought that Oppenheimer was a Soviet spy, but they did agree, yes, he did sabotage efforts. And so Lawrence was coming in to give a testimony. And when he was met the night before, he went to they had a special meeting of laboratory directors run by the Atomic Energy Commission. And while he was there, he was accosted by Robbie and other senior members of the Atomic Energy Commission. And Lawrence realized that with the failure in the Kuhn event, with the failure of the latest Livermore test, on top of him testifying against Oppenheimer, that they were going to shut down the Livermore laboratory. And he got so stressed out that that night he excused himself from the dinner table, went to a bathroom and started vomiting blood. And he had a colitis attack. He had an attack of colitis, called up his brother, who was a doctor, and he got him back to San Francisco real quick, to San Francisco General Hospital. And Oppenheimer called up Louis Alvarez and said, I don't think it's a good idea. They're gonna close down the laboratory. But Alvarez thought about it, and he decided he was not going to let these people intimidate him. And so he still remained a witness. And of course, Teller remained a witness. And for that, they were ostracized by the physics community of America as being McCarthyist. You know, they were accused of trying to spoil Oppenheimer's reputation. And Oppenheimer was building on this thing, and I think it worked, right? Because 3/4 of a century later, they got a movie, still saying the same thing.
Yeah.
But anyway, Livermore got a bad reputation within the physics community because of that. And I met physicists at the lab who were around in the 1950s. And they told me, Tom, the first time I even heard the word Livermore was at graduate school, and I was to sign a petition condemning the place. So it really worked hard. We had 3 failures. They were about to shut the laboratory down. Lawrence was in the hospital with colitis, and then Teller was so stressed out, he came down with an attack of colitis, and he's in the hospital. And wow. So the whole program at Livermore, Herb York got sick with valley fever. The whole program at Livermore boiled down to 2 group leaders running the atomic program and the thermonuclear program. And that's Johnny Foster running the atomic program at Livermore, and Harold Brown running the thermonuclear program. And the facts were, if they failed one more time, Livermore would be shut down. But they both came up with new innovative designs. It was that matrix management working, I think, but they both came up with brand new designs that were smaller than anything ever seen. And I call them upstarts in the sense that they picked up the baton that Lawrence had carried in World War II, and now they were carrying it into the Cold War to carry a new sort of thing, okay? And Foster's idea was the thing called the Clio. It was going to be the smallest atomic device ever tested up to that time. It was so small, they fit it into that suitcase. You can see it, the suitcase making it into the test site. They tested it. It worked perfectly, exactly the way Foster had predicted. By the way, the Clio was the gentleman looking at eating a sandwich on top of an atomic bomb. His name is Tommy. He's a graduate. He's a summer intern from San Jose State University. They'd hired, and Walt Arnold, driving the car, he said, Tommy, I want you to go into building 123 and pick up 2 suitcases and put them in the back of the station wagon. So Tommy does, and then Arnold gives him a .45 caliber Army pistol. Says, here, guard the suitcases. Don't let anybody touch the suitcases. And Tommy says, okay. And he gets in there, and they close it up, and they transport the atomic bomb to Nevada in the back of a Woody station wagon. And that was security back in the 1950s. And that's Tommy eating a ham and cheese sandwich using an atomic bomb as his lunch table.
Oh, my goodness.
We tested. It works exactly the way it was supposed to. And the monkey's off the back of the people. Then 2 weeks later, Harold Brown also tests a new thermonuclear device. It's extraordinarily different than the Mike device that Los Alamos had detonated in November '52, and it worked exactly the way they said it would work. And it was smaller. It was just a fraction of the size of existing weapons, and so they were on their way. And so after the success, there was no more talk of shutting down the laboratory. And the laboratory was given Site 300 to conduct hydro tests. They also created Sandia Laboratory across the street to support now Livermore, which would now be supplying nuclear weapons to the thing. Now here I wanted to illustrate a little bit. I mentioned Mike May earlier. Mike is a great hero of mine. He's alive and quite well in living in San Francisco at the moment. At the time, the big bomb, it's a hydrogen bomb, was run by the Strategic Air Command only. That's the B-17, and you can see it there. It's like 6 feet or 8 feet in diameter,
Yeah.
and it's 46,000 pounds. It weighs so much that the Air Force had to invent a new bomber. It's the B-36, I think it is. That's, you see it behind there. And the bomber carried one bomb. One bomber carried one bomb, and the thing in there. In the movie Dr. Strangelove, when Slim Pickens rides the bomb down, that's the bomb he's riding. That's the thing he's riding down there. Anyway, Mike May came up with a device 1/4 the size of that thing, and it had better performance. It had much better performance, and that was the revolutionary thing happening at Livermore.
Yeah.
And okay, now the final part. These great advances are going on due to matrix management and bright young people. And there was a crisis going on at the time. And what it was the Soviet Union was getting more aggressive in its attitudes. They were threatening to invade Western Europe. And Khrushchev, who had replaced Stalin, was threatening the capitals of Western Europe with his own atom bombs. And the strategic plan at the time was Eisenhower's massive retaliation plan, in which if the Russians were to invade Western Europe, the United States would respond by a massive attack against the Soviet Union, and we'd just flatten the Soviet Union. And the policy analyst up at Livermore said that's not a good plan because anything that would really start, obviously that would be World War III, and the United States would suffer greatly because the Soviet Union would certainly retaliate. And they came up with alternative plans, which would later be called counterforce plans. But the key to all this was your force that you were going to counter against the Soviet Union had to be highly survivable, so it was not a temptation to the Soviets to obliterate it. And once they obliterated the U.S. nuclear stockpile, the Russians could do whatever they want without worry of recourse. And the problem was these big bombs resided on these big bombers. They were very obvious where they were. Now, they were starting to get ICBMs at this time, the Atlas, but even they were huge liquid-fueled things that took a half an hour to an hour to launch. And so they were all subject to surprise attack. And Rand Corporation did a study and showed that the Soviets, if they wanted to, could conduct a surprise attack and knock out all of our SAC bases and knock out all of our atomic weapons in one secret attack. Mm. And that started this big hullabaloo in Washington. And then Admiral Ollie Burke, who is the chief of naval operations, said, well, you know what? What if we launched our atom bombs or our nuclear weapons out of submerged submarines? You can't sneak attack a submarine. And they said, well, that's all fine. The problem was these bombs were way too big to fit inside a missile, inside a submarine. The missiles inside submarines had to be 1/3 the size of what they were on land. They had to be really small. And they also needed a very small, light warhead. And at this meeting at NOBSCA conference, Edward Teller stood up and told Admiral Burke, Livermore Laboratory will give you a warhead for your fleet ballistic missile.
Wow.
And Burke got up and said, okay, it's a deal. And he made a contract with Livermore. And so Livermore was on, and they had to come up with a warhead. And they did. They did ask, I'll skip all that part, but it seemed to be impossible. You could not do it that quickly. But Livermore did. Within 36 months, they had a warhead. It became the W-47, the warhead for the Polaris missile. And you see it there being tested. And in the top picture, that's the physicists at Livermore celebrating that they succeeded in getting a warhead for Polaris on time. In the lower right, you actually see they tested it out of the Pacific, and it worked. Everything worked. And they launched the first Polaris submarine just as Kennedy became president in January 1960. actually 1 year before Kennedy became president. But anyway, when Kennedy became president, he had 10 Polaris submarines out there, and they had a brand new strategic deterrent force that had not existed before, that was totally invulnerable to a sneak attack. And Kennedy would later admit that gave him a lot of backbone.
Yeah.
He got elected. 3 months later, he meets Khrushchev in Vienna, and Khrushchev gives Kennedy an ultimatum: you got to get out of Berlin, because the Red Army is now going to occupy West Berlin. And it was clear later he would occupy all of Germany. Kennedy knew he couldn't do that. He was not going to submit 2.5 million Germans in West Berlin to communism, and he knew he couldn't do it. And his face turned white. He came back to the Washington, told his national security staff, we're going to have a thermonuclear war by the end of the year, because we had 6 months to get out of Berlin. And Kennedy says, we're not going to do that. So then he started a program, and they started building fallout shelters all over America. And the program was to protect Americans against the thermonuclear war against Russia. Kennedy was convinced we're going to war. But he had the Polaris submarines, and he later admitted the idea that he knew he had a weapon that could destroy the Soviet Union, no matter what they did to us, gave him the backbone to stand up to Khrushchev. Khrushchev looked at it, he looked at Polaris, and then he blinked and he stepped back. And instead of invading West Berlin, he built the Berlin Wall, and that ended the crisis. So 6 months later, Kennedy wanted to thank those physicists at Livermore for giving him the means to get through that very serious nuclear crisis. So he flew out to Berkeley. And in the picture on the left, you can see now the guy on the far left is Norris Bradbury, the head of Los Alamos. He was there watching, and it's symbolic. He's looking off away from the scene. Everyone's looking at the young president. And it's kind of symbolic that Los Alamos had its golden era in World War II when it stopped World War II. But now it's the time for the president to celebrate the second laboratory and its contributions in the Cold War. So next to Bradbury, that's Johnny Foster. Next to Johnny Foster, who by that time was the head of the laboratory. Next to him is Edwin McMillan, the man who discovered neptunium. Next to him is Glenn Seaborg, the man who discovered plutonium. There's the president. There's Edward Teller, Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, and there's Harold Brown on the far right. And they were so proud. I talked to Mike May. I said, Mike, what was it like meeting President Kennedy? He says, Tom, he walked into the lobby, had a big smile on his face. He walked up to me, shook my hand, and said, thank you. He said it was the proudest day of my life.
Wow.
Then Kennedy comes out to the football stadium at Berkeley, and that's him right there in the middle. And in front of 85,000 people, he says, I am forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. The new frontier, that was his administration, may well owe more to Berkeley than it does to Harvard. And so it was a public acclamation. And I want to finish here that there are lessons today in this. The way Kennedy handled those threats coming out of Khrushchev, he stood up to him right away, did not give 1 inch, made it perfectly clear to Khrushchev that no, you will not take over Berlin. No, it is U.S. policy that we will have a free West Germany and a free West Berlin. And today we have Putin doing the same bloody thing to Ukraine. I only wish that our administration today would make it policy. It is U.S. policy that Ukraine will remain independent, as we promised we would do for them back in 1994 with the Budapest Accords. We said, we assure you that you will maintain your independence. We need to make that a strong signal to Putin that the United States will fully back Ukraine's independence instead of going piecemeal as we are now. And I think that's a big lesson that we have to take to it with us from history. And with that, I think I'll shut up. I don't know if I've gone over my time or not.
No,
Ray, back to you.
You've done really well. Go ahead and unshare your screen, if you will. And we'll finish up by saying that what you've brought to us is some history that I'm not sure we've had presented just like that, as concisely as you did, and I really appreciate that. And again, the book that we're talking about is From Berkeley to Berlin, Tom Ramos, and he has done an excellent job in that book. I really appreciate that. And again, thank you, Tom, for being with us today. And next time now, we're going to have Cameron Reed, who will be coming on. And Cameron will be talking about a new book that he has. and I have the name of it here. It's called The Encyclopedia of the Manhattan Project. And so we'll have Cameron talk to us about that. Thank you all so much for being with us, and we'll look forward to the next time. Okay, if I can get this thing to stop now.